Tonight we've come to the book of Ezekiel in our walk through the Bible. Ezekiel was a young man as this gets started. You may remember that the nation of Judah was conquered by the nation of Babylon, but it didn't happen all at one time. Nebuchadnezzar won a decisive battle against Assyria and Egypt, and on his way home, he conquered Jerusalem. And he took with him Daniel and Daniel's friends that we later come to call Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So he took some of the best and the brightest. He robbed the temple there in Jerusalem and took anything of value he could carry with him, which was a lot, and took it back to Babylon with him. And then about 7 years later, he came back. And this time he captured the king of Judah, and he took with him 10,000 of its citizens. And among them was a young man of 25 years of age named Ezekiel. Ezekiel has a wife, and so we don't know if they were already married at that point or if they got married on the way or once they got to Babylon. But Ezekiel is one of these captives in the second part of this exile from Judah. And he and his family settle in a farming community along one of the rivers that flows near Babylon. And we think of captives as being slaves or people in chains, but their situation was a little different. They were basically removed from their homeland, so that part's bad. But then they were given a place to settle, to build houses, to cultivate the land, to farm. And so Ezekiel is living among a community of exiled folks. They're God's people. They're people who have the promises of Abraham and who have God's word, and yet they no longer live in Jerusalem. And they're cut off from the temple, and they're cut off from the people of God. And so this is the group that Ezekiel is among and the group that Ezekiel will minister to. If you're wondering how Ezekiel fits in the rest of the Bible, let me tell you that part before we get too much further. We've looked at Jeremiah and Lamentations already. Jeremiah is a little older than Ezekiel, maybe 20 years or so older. And you might remember that Jeremiah is an eyewitness to the destruction of Jerusalem. So while Ezekiel goes into Babylon in exile, Jeremiah stays, and he watches the destruction that's coming, and he is there after the destruction of Jerusalem until he is kidnapped and carried away to Egypt. Ezekiel is also a contemporary of Daniel. And Ezekiel and Daniel are probably close to the same age. But Daniel, you might remember me just telling you, was among the first set of captives, and Ezekiel is among the second set of captives. And Ezekiel is in farming land along the river. Where's Daniel? He's in the palace. He becomes one of the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel will continue to serve past the Babylonian Empire on into the Persian Empire. God uses him in an incredible, powerful way. Ezekiel will refer to Daniel. And in fact, he mentions some of the most righteous people in all of history, being Noah and Daniel is one of the people that he mentions, and Job. And so Ezekiel will call Daniel by name, and his reputation, he's a contemporary figure, but Ezekiel will have good things to say about Daniel. The people that Ezekiel lived with were thinking, okay, we're separated from our homeland, but in a little while, God will wipe out these Babylonians and we'll get to go back home. And so there were prophets who were telling the people that kind of thing, because that's what people wanted to hear. But Ezekiel has a very different word. Ezekiel has a word from the true God. And Ezekiel's message is very different, and it's not one that the people want to hear. Ezekiel tells them they're there for the long run. They're really not going home, not that generation. Their children might, but it's going to be over 70 years that they're going to be captives there in Babylon, and that the temple that they've been cut off from, it's going to be destroyed completely. And so Ezekiel has some powerful visions that he shares with the people, and the people don't like Ezekiel's message, and they don't like Ezekiel, and they don't like Ezekiel's God. And so Ezekiel has a tough role to fulfill. The book of Ezekiel is sometimes very difficult to understand, and God asked Ezekiel to do some very strange things. And all of these are object lessons. What's an object lesson? Sometimes we'll have a children's sermon. My brother used to do children's sermon where it would be the preacher and a sack. He'd have something in a sack every week, and he'd pull something out of the sack and then try to make some kind of spiritual application from whatever was in the sack. Well, I don't know if I want to do that with just anything in a sack. I don't know if I could think that quickly I'm sure there's an application. I just don't know if it would occur to me to say it at the right time. But, children like object lessons. They like things you can touch and see, and Ezekiel is about object lessons. So God has him tie himself up. God has him cook food over, you'll have to read for yourself. God has him lie on his side for a certain number of days. When his wife dies, he's not allowed to mourn her death. So there's just a lot of activities that take place that God will use as an object lesson. And so in a sense, Ezekiel kind of becomes a living sermon in addition to the prophetic words. But there are also some powerful, life-changing, heart-changing passages in Ezekiel. And so I know we're not going to have time to go through all the chapters, but I do want to hit some highlights with you tonight. So look, if you will, at chapter 1. Chapter 1 is one of the strangest accounts in all of the Bible. If you are, some people like science fiction books or science fiction movies or that kind of thing. And there was a time in our country where Star Trek or Star Wars or those kind of things had a lot of popularity. As you read Ezekiel 1, you can't help but think about this as being very, very strange, almost in a science fiction kind of category. He will describe living creatures, and you'll see Lottie's artistic depiction here, and the descriptions are just fascinating. Let's start reading chapter 1. I'll start at verse 4. I looked and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and their feet were like those of a calf, and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had human hands, and all 4 of them had faces and wings, and the wings of one touched the wings of another. And each one went straight ahead, and they did not turn as they moved. I told you this was right strange. Now, we are aware that God has created many beautiful and wonderful things. Creation declares the glory of God. So whether you're looking at plant life or mountains or the ocean or the creatures that fill the sky and fill the ocean and fill the land that God has made, they all bring glory to God. One of my favorite parts of the book of Job is about the joy that God takes in all the little strange creatures he's made. Well, some of them aren't so little. He'll mention Behemoth and Leviathan, just huge monsters that we would call them monsters. But God looks at them as a display of his power and of his creative energy and strength. And you can just read the joy that God's creation gives to him. So that's just kind of an amazing insight. So God's created all kinds of things here on earth, but here we get a little bit of a glimpse of heavenly creatures. And they're referred to in two different ways in this passage. They are called living creatures, and you'll see why as we keep reading, but they're also called cherubim. And that's a term that's been used earlier in the Bible. You might remember even in Genesis, as Adam and Eve were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, God places a cherubim with a flaming sword at the entrance so that they will not return to the Garden of Eden. What was in the Garden of Eden? The tree of life. How horrible it would be to live forever in a fallen state. To live forever with greed and pride and lust and anger consuming us. And so God protected them by placing that flaming sword, that cherub there. And you may remember even in the instructions that God gave to Moses about the tabernacle, that in the curtains and in the archistry, cherubim were depicted there. And in fact, the Holy of Holies had a throne-type seat, and it was encompassed by the wings of these cherubim. So this is not an unknown figure, but Ezekiel's description is stronger than any we've gotten so far. And as you keep reading, many of the things in Ezekiel you'll see again when you get to the book of Revelation. Because there in Revelation, we find these four living creatures surrounding the throne of God. And so many of the images here we will see again as we keep reading. Well, I stopped at verse 9. Look at verse 10. Their faces look like this. Each of the four had the face of a human being. And on the right side, each had the face of a lion. And on the left, the face of an ox. And also the face of an eagle. So these four faces are depicted. And if you think about these things, a human being, the pinnacle of God's creation, a lion who is king of the wild beasts, an ox who is strongest of the domesticated animals, and an eagle who we think of, even still today, as being sort of the king of the skies. And so these living creatures represent the creatures that God has made. Does God care about everything he's made? Aren't there some things that are just kind of waste product, or, I made ants, but I don't really like them? What's that? He did. In fact, he says so. And God said it was good. Yeah. So these living creatures represent the way that creation brings God glory and honor. And so we have these beautiful descriptions. Now, I have to tell you that later on in church history, they took each one of these images and associated it with a different one of the four Gospels. And so in medieval art and that kind of thing, you'll see one of these animals depicted with each gospel writer. John is the eagle because he's really different. Luke, who emphasizes Jesus' servant nature, is depicted often with the ox that way. And so Mark the lion, you'll see, if you've ever been to Venice or that kind of thing, you'll see lots of lions there in St. Mark's Square. And Matthew with the face of the human. So I stopped reading at verse 10. Let me pick up at 11. Such were their faces. They each had 2 wings spreading out upward, each wing touching that of the creature on either side. Each had 2 other wings covering its body. Wherever each one went straight ahead, wherever the Spirit would go, they would go without turning as they went. And the appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals of fire or like torches. Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. The creatures sped back and forth like flashes of lightning. So, that strange enough for y'all yet? These are fiery creatures who move as fast as lightning. And then verse 15. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each of the creature with its 4 faces. And this was the appearance and the structure of the wheels. They sparkled like topaz, and all 4 looked alike, and each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. And as they moved, they would go in any one of the 4 directions the creatures faced, and the wheels did not change direction as the creatures went. Their rims were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around. Wow. Okay, a really good question. Dana asked, why 4? Why 4 living creatures? That kind of thing. In the language of the Old and New Testament, Hebrew and Greek, numbers have great significance. 4 is a number that represents the earth. And so sometimes we think of east and west and south and north. Are there other 4 things that kind of represent us? 3 is a number that represents God and heaven. And 3 plus 4 is 7, which is a number that represents completeness, wholeness. And so Jesus asked us to pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, where? On earth as it is in heaven. And so these numbers come to have value and significance that way. So a wheel within wheels, and these creatures are fast. They can move like lightning. And they can go in any direction because the wheels are, well, it's just an engineering phenomenon. Yes, they are spirit-led, and the wheels have eyes everywhere. Well, what do you do with your eyes? All right, you look around, you see with your eyes. Maybe I should give away the meaning of this vision. That might help us at this point. I'll just go ahead and disclose that. All right, we have a tendency to put God in a box. He's the one we worship on Sunday. But, you know, he doesn't have anything to do with how we live on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday. Or he might be the God of, hymns, but not the God of what we watch on television. Or he might be the God of our interests as far as they relate to church people, but maybe not scientific study or something else we're doing. We have a tendency to put God in a box and say, okay, God, you can have this part of my life, but no more and no further. We do that. Would y'all agree to that part? Concede that? We're good at building boxes for God. Well, God is great at getting out of our boxes. He is not going to be boxed in. He is a God who is above and beyond our imagination. And throughout Scripture, he demonstrates that over and over and over. Well, the ancient people had this idea that God stopped at the border of the country. So you've got a God of Judah, and then you've got lots of gods, but, main gods of Babylon. And so if Babylon beats Judah, in their minds, the Babylonian gods were beating the God of Judah. Does that make sense? So they tended to associate God with a particular territory. Y'all might remember back the story of Naaman. What does he ask for after he's healed of leprosy? What's the one thing he wants to take back with him to Syria? Y'all didn't know there was going to be a test tonight. Trivia. He wants dirt. Dirt. He wants dirt from Israel, because that's where God is, to take back with him to Syria. Not entirely. And I know we might look at those people and think, oh, how silly. But I just told you we do the same thing. We compartmentalize. We allow God to do this and not that kind of thing. This vision is a powerful vision that lets us know that God is not limited by anything. He is not limited by time or space. He is not limited by the borders of countries. He is not limited by history. He is not limited by the fact that the temple is going to be destroyed. He is not limited by the fact that Judah is going to be defeated and its people are going to be brought into exile or killed. God is still God, and he is everywhere, and he sees everything. And so this vision of living creatures, wheels within wheels, and eyes on the wheels is a way of helping them to know that God is not going to fit into any box. He is greater and beyond that. If you were to keep reading in chapter 1, you would discover that all those things we've been describing are just preliminaries, because they are the base, they are the foundation for a throne. And the throne is described, but there's just a brief description of the one who is on the throne. Look at verse 27. I saw from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire, and that from there down he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him, like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. I should have brought crayons and paper for y'all tonight, for you to draw out what God looks like. Oh, okay. Well, Ezekiel sees this powerful vision of God, but it's not like any vision we've had before. And God is above and beyond our description. And so the emphasis here is on God's throne and its ability to be all places at all times. What does the image of a throne communicate? Why the emphasis on a throne of God? He is the universe's true and only king. And he is sovereign. And to say that God is sovereign means that he can work through even the worst of situations to bring about his good purpose. And so this powerful vision in chapter 1 lays the foundation for everything that's going to happen, because Ezekiel now has a view of a big God. Not a limited God, not a boxed up God, but a God for whom nothing is impossible. Would it change our lives if we also had a vision of a God for whom nothing is impossible? Well, or if we just understood with our heart and our heads that nothing's impossible for God. You know, Jesus is constantly saying to his disciples, ye of little faith. Or to say that another way, y'all just don't realize how big God is. Y'all just don't realize how great God is. Y'all just don't realize that nothing is impossible for our God. And so you have little faith, little trust. If we knew how big God was, would we worry about anything? No. Would we be afraid? No. Well, we might fear God, but we wouldn't be afraid of the things that God is greater than, right? So this powerful vision in chapter 1 sets the stage. If you look at chapter 2, Ezekiel is called to be a prophet, and this takes place when Ezekiel turns 30 years of age, which would have been the time that he would have become a priest. Now, he's not in the temple anymore, and as we keep reading, the temple is going to be destroyed. But Ezekiel is given a special calling, and his calling is rough because God basically says, I'm sending you to these exiles. They're not going to listen to you. They're not going to believe you. Their hearts are like stone. Now, I don't really know what it's like to talk to a brick wall, but talking to people whose hearts are made of stone would be worse. So Ezekiel is given a very, very hard task. And if you look at chapter 3, you might have a Bible that has headings. Mine says Ezekiel's task as watchman. His role is to warn the people. And this is a theme that runs all the way through Ezekiel as well. Ezekiel will give the warning. Now, we're driving down the road and the bridge is out. And there hadn't been time to put up a sign, so we're standing there at the edge of the road to tell people to stop, to warn them that the bridge is out. Y'all with me? If we don't warn them and they go over the bridge and plunge to their death, whose fault is it? Yeah, we knew about it. We could have warned them. We didn't warn them. Yes, thank you for asking, because that's exactly what happens here. Ezekiel will tell them the bridge is out. They'll keep on going. Is it Ezekiel's fault? Nope. He has given the warning, but the people chose to ignore it. All right, just as Ezekiel is a watchman, I believe as Christians in this world filled with evil and pain and sin, we've been given a message of hope, a message that people need to hear, right? So just as Ezekiel is a watchman, so are we. Well, as you keep turning pages, you'll see lots and lots of these strange things that God asked Ezekiel to do. When you get to chapter 10, there's a difficult passage about how the glory of God leaves his temple. And it's because the temple is filled with idolatrous people, people that are worshiping other gods. And so God's glory departs from his very temple. And so that's depicted in chapter 10. Turn over a few more pages to chapter 18, and you get a foundation for kind of our understanding of how God relates to us in the world. If your father is an alcoholic, will that have any effect on your life? It will? All right. Does it determine your life? It doesn't, but it has an effect. We can agree on that. You might follow in his footsteps and have your life controlled by alcohol. Or you might see the damage it's done and say, okay, I'm not going to ever drink a drop. So it could have a positive or a negative effect, right? But does it have an effect? Yeah. How about his grandson? Well, if the man's an alcoholic, does it affect his grandson's life? How about his great-grandson? Kind of depends on how long everybody lives, but even if he were to die early it would still have an effect. Y'all with me? All right, so the people of this time had this idea that the sins of one generation got passed down to another generation. And you can see why they would think that way. Because, in a sense, we inherit natural tendencies and we inherit the environment. And so, in a sense, if someone chooses to disobey God, that gets passed down and it affects things. That next generation can make their own choices, but there's an effect there. So they had an expression: the fathers eat sour grapes and their children's teeth are set on edge. So don't be eating those sour grapes. Go mess up your kids' teeth. Well, chapter 18 of Ezekiel contradicts that idea. And it's a very important passage. Let's tune in to chapter 18. I'll start reading about verse 19. Yet you ask, why does the son not share the guilt of his father? Since the son has done what is just and right and has been careful to keep all my decrees, he will surely live. The one who sins is the one who will die. The child will not share the guilt of the parent, nor will the parent share the guilt of the child. The righteousness of the righteous will be credited to them, and the wickedness of the wicked will be charged against them. So while our parents' choices affect us, when we stand before God in all eternity, whose decisions are going to be called into question? Yes, regardless of what environment you grew up in, regardless of what you inherited, regardless of your natural tendencies, you will be judged for your choices and your choices alone. So this chapter helps us to understand the idea that each one of us is personally responsible before God. So, do people go through life blaming their parents? Yes. Some people go to their graves blaming their parents. But this chapter helps us to understand that regardless of what we grew up in, regardless of whether it was good or bad, we're responsible for our own choices before God. Now, this gets a little bit confusing because there is individual responsibility, and that's what chapter 18 emphasizes. There's also corporate responsibility. So you're responsible for you, and I'm responsible for me. Y'all got that part, right? But we're part of a nation, right? If our nation sins against God, are we responsible? The answer is yes, because we're part of that nation. So there's individual responsibility, but there is still corporate responsibility. And that's a terrifying thought, isn't it? So, chapter 18 of Ezekiel. Turn over a few more pages. And let me just point out another weird section, strange. In chapter 28 of Ezekiel, we have a glimpse into Satan and who he is. And let me preface this by saying that this passage is talking about the king of Tyre. Now, the king of Tyre is not Satan. Satan is bigger than the king of Tyre. Would y'all agree with that? But the king of Tyre's actions are similar to Satan's. Do y'all remember in the New Testament that Peter has this beautiful, powerful vision of who Jesus is? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, God has revealed this to you, Peter. You didn't come up with this on your own. And then Jesus begins to tell them how he's going to be crucified and die. And Peter says, no, Lord, we're not going to let that happen to you. Y'all remember what Jesus says next? Yes. Get away from me, Satan. You have in mind the things of men, not the things of God. Right? Was Peter Satan? No, but in that moment, he represented him. And I'm afraid we do that sometimes too. Well, the king of Tyre brings on this account of Satan. So let's read what it says, because it's interesting. Ezekiel 28, I'll start middle of verse 12, I guess that is. You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone adorned you. Carnelian, I won't read all you see some precious stones written there. Your settings and mountings were made of gold. On the day you were created, they were prepared. You were anointed, set apart, as a guardian cherub, for so I ordained you. You were on the holy mount of God. You walked among the fiery stones. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created. So I mentioned that this is a description of Satan. Y'all might have been thinking it was going to be, a guy in a red suit with a pitchfork and pointy ears. And that isn't how he's described here. How is he described here? Absolutely beautiful. Beauty greater than, everybody else's except God's. God is more beautiful. But here, Satan is perfect in beauty. And he's in the Garden of Eden. He's in this beautiful garden that God provided. He has access to heaven. And his conduct, blameless. And who created him? God. Did God create evil? No, God created this beautiful, angelic being. Powerful, wonderful, blameless. Well, I noticed I didn't read the last part of verse 15. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till wickedness was found in you. And through your widespread trade, now he's kind of writing more to Tyre, you were filled with violence and you sinned. So I drove you in disgrace from the mount of God. I expelled you, guardian cherub, from among the fiery stones. Your heart became proud on account of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. So I threw you to the earth, and I made a spectacle of you before kings. Wow. What was Satan's downfall? Pride. What is our downfall? Pride. So here we get kind of a glimpse, not only of Satan's story, but of our story. Satan rebels against God. Who wins? God. Who will win? God. There's really no contest. Well, the first part of Ezekiel talks about judgment and destruction. And it's enough to make a happy person cry. But when you get to the last section of Ezekiel, the tone changes. And so before we run out of time, let me highlight some of that. Chapter 34 is powerful. There, God says, hey, you have shepherds who are lining their own pockets. You have shepherds who don't care a thing about the sheep. So tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to get rid of them shepherds. And I'm going to go and I'm going to find all the lost sheep. And I'm going to rescue them. And I'm going to bandage them. And I'm going to heal them. And I'm going to care for them. And in the flock, there are some sheep that are fat. And the reason they're fat is that they won't let any of the other sheep near the trough. So as the new shepherd, I'm going to destroy the fat sheep. And I'm going to take care of the weak sheep. And keep reading there. And he does something else. Look at chapter 34, verse 23. I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them. He will tend them and be their shepherd. Well, Ezekiel is writing this in the 500s BC. David lived in about 1000 BC. So David's been dead 500 years or so. How's he going to be a shepherd? What shepherd is God talking about? He's talking about Jesus. So when we get to the New Testament and Jesus begins to say, I am the good shepherd. The shepherds that have come before, they've been lying in their own pockets. They've been mistreating the sheep. I'm the good shepherd. And when the sheep are attacked, I'm not going to run off. I will lay down my life for my sheep. And my sheep, they hear my voice and they follow me. So this beautiful passage in Ezekiel 34 reminds us of what Jesus, the Good Shepherd, is going to do for us. Turn the page, a couple of pages, and you get to chapter 37. This is probably the most famous part of the book of Ezekiel. God takes Ezekiel out to a valley filled with dry bones. Evidently, there has been a horrible, terrible battle. And I have to tell you that one of the worst fears of people in the ancient world is that they would die and nobody bury them. So to have your bones just scattered out in a big valley was about one of the worst things that the ancient mind could conceive of. That just was a death without honor. So Ezekiel is told to preach to these bones. Now, I've preached to some folks that weren't very lively before, but I don't know that I've had to preach to a valley filled with dry bones. But Ezekiel obeyed the word of the Lord, and he preached to these dry bones. And do y'all know what happened? Anybody know the song? Yes. What bone was connected to the other? Y'all know that song? I need to learn the words to that song. Now hear the word of the Lord, right? So the bones come together and they begin to be covered with flesh, but they're not alive. And then God says, Ezekiel, preach again. And God's Spirit begins to fill these corpses, and they become a living, breathing, mighty army before the Lord. The message: God can take what's dead and bring it back to life. God can take a dead church and renew it and restore it and revive it. God can take a nation that has turned its back on him and bring it back to life. Ezekiel has a big God, a God for whom nothing is impossible, not even a valley of dry bones. Well, can't leave without one more. Ezekiel 47, incredible image. I had the chance when I was in my 20s to spend some time in Israel. And in Israel, in a little place called Magdaba, there is a little church, and it looked a lot like our little churches. And I went inside, and there was like a little children's Sunday school area. And it looked a lot like our children's Sunday school areas. And they had a rug on the floor. But if you pull back the rug in tile, there's one of the oldest maps in all the history of the world. Right there in the children's Sunday school area. This old map, one of the oldest in the whole world, pictures the land of Israel. It pictures the Sea of Galilee. It pictures the Jordan River. What's at the end of the Jordan River? The Dead Sea. So in this oldest map in the world, it has fish happily swimming in the Jordan River until they get to the Dead Sea. And then they have a sour expression on their face, and they turn around and swim back the other way. Why? Nothing lives in the Dead Sea. I got to float in the Dead Sea. I say float because you can't swim in the Dead Sea. The salt content is so high that all you can do is float. And when you come out of the Dead Sea, regardless of what skin color you were when you went in, you are completely white because your skin is covered in salt. The Dead Sea. Well, in chapter 47, Ezekiel has an incredible vision. There is a river we'll see again in the book of Revelation, the river of life. It flows from the throne of God. It flows through the altar. And everywhere the water touches, there's life. And so as the water makes its way down, you picture the desert and the hard, dry places teeming with life. Life like was in the Garden of Eden life. I mean, just beautiful, wonderful life. And it follows, this river comes on down. What do you think happens when it gets to the Dead Sea? Not this river. This river has more life than the Dead Sea can. And when this water gets to the Dead Sea, it transforms it too. Everywhere the water touches, there is life. When Jesus talks to that woman at the well, and he says, you could have asked and I would have given you living water. This is part of what he's talking about. When you get to Revelation, there's a river of life, and we're told that we are given to drink from it freely. Not free to us, of course, because it cost Jesus his life. But it's given to us freely because of what Jesus has done for us. So Ezekiel has this powerful, powerful vision of this river. And it's interesting even the way the story tells, because at first, Ezekiel is just into his ankles. And then he wades a little deeper to his knees. And then to his thighs. Have y'all ever gotten into a pool really slowly that way? Or water? And that creates a very interesting image, because sometimes all we want is an ankle's worth of God. We just wade into our ankles. Is that all God has for us? No. What if eventually we get in over our heads with God? What if we surrender completely to him? And so here's a powerful picture of what it means to be immersed in the water of life. Water that flows past the altar from the very throne of God. Father, thank you for your incredible word. Thank you for the images and for the pictures there that change our perspective on the things that we face on a daily basis. Help us to remember that you are an incredible God. Amen.